All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this month's Local to Global program, where we're featuring Caitlin Allen, CEO of Global Affairs Associates, who will be discussing a term that's been prevalent in conversations within a number of varying industries: environmental, social, and governance, also known as ESG. A part of the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston, Local to Global engages career professionals in peer-driven learning and dialogue on leading international affairs issues and topics of interest. Local to Global events are informal yet informative, emphasizing discussion, dialogue, and interaction. Currently, Local to Global provides programs and workshops to help professionals of all stages navigate their careers during these times, helping prepare them for a global future. A couple of reminders before we begin. Tomorrow at noon, our Global Connections program will be featuring Regina Mayer, Head of Energy and Natural Resources at KPMG. And after we return from the Thanksgiving break, we will be hosting celebrity travel icon Rick Steves for a one-of-a-kind program on Wednesday, December 2nd. Sign up today at wachhouston.org. And now on to our speaker. Caitlin Allen is a sustainability-focused entrepreneur, business owner, and CEO. She's a sought-after expert on ESG investing and corporate sustainability communications strategy. In 2013, Caitlin founded her consultancy, Global Affairs Associates, which helps clients bridge business and sustainability. She and her team believe that business-centered approaches are crucial for creating long-lasting value. As CEO, Caitlin has grown Global Affairs Associates from an individual consulting practice to a well-respected boutique firm in Houston. As principal consultant, Caitlin has consulted on sustainability and ESG issues, including strategy, risk, communications, and transparency for a variety of industries, including oil and gas, drilling, construction, midstream, and manufacturing.
Thank you so much, Jahan. It's great to be here. If any of you are connected to me on LinkedIn, you know that I posted about this because I have been a huge fan and frequent attendee of World Affairs Council events since I was a teenager. As a native Houstonian, this was sort of my haven for my international affairs passion. So it's really, really special for me personally tonight to kind of bring that full circle and be able to share a little bit about a subject I'm passionate about now. So we're just really grateful for the invitation. So I'm going to just share my screen here. I am going to take you guys through basically a 101, ESG 101. So many of you have heard of environmental social governance. We're going to unpack that a little bit. There is, as Jahan said, is a term that's being used widely now. And I think that we could all, benefit from getting on the same page about definitions and, massive amounts of variable trends that are impacting this particular trend. So tonight I'm going to give you an overview of that, what it is, unpack the term a little bit, give you a little bit of history, and then talk about why. Why are we seeing ESG everywhere, and what are the implications of that, more broadly speaking. So I believe, Bob, I saw that you put in the chat that your microphone wasn't enabled, but Jahan, if you, it seems like a pretty small group. If you guys want to be able to just go on ahead and ask a question, I welcome that. You can also put it in the chat and Jahan will let me know. So I'm just going to start just to tell you a little bit about our firm. We are one of only two, I believe, boutique ESG consulting firms in Houston. And we have been doing this work for about 7.5 years. And seeing the trend evolve to what it is today. So I'm going to share a little bit about that with you. So first of all, let's get all on the same page about definitions. So corporate social responsibility, and I won't read them to you, but corporate social responsibility, or CSR, was really the term of choice in the early 2000s and into a little bit into the 2010s. What we've seen is a shift, particularly with the Paris Agreement, the launch of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. You've seen that emphasis in corporate terminology from CSR to sustainability, going back to the Sustainable Development definition that was developed in the 1980s, the Brundtland Commission, which is essentially, maintaining the ability to meet the needs of present generations without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So a little bit broader, actually a lot broader than the CSR term, which is really just focused on the role of corporations in society. So, and actually, I'll just hop over to this while I'm explaining. So the establishment of these, global frameworks and norms have really played a major role in why you've seen that shift in terminology from CSR to sustainability, and then more recently to ESG. So let me hop back here. So ESG, right? That's sort of the next generation of CSR sustainability to where we are now. And our reading of ESG is that it's basically the investment community's term of choice, because CSR, sustainability, there can be connotations there, related to activism, or some people see it as political, which I disagree. I think we can all agree we want to, want to live in a world that's sustainably developed. But that aside, the term ESG has become that term of use for investors because it's basically just describes the facts, right? Which is that the health of a company is more than what's on its balance sheet. So you can look at the financial statements of a company and think it's doing pretty well, but they might have really substantial environmental risks, social risks, for example, manufacturing with a supply chain around the world, might have labor risk exposure, human rights issues, and then governance, of course, which has been around a bit longer than the ENS, really since the fall of Enron in the early 2000s. So ESG is sort of a catch-all for anything about a company that's not on the balance sheet. That's what we like to say. And then we have this concept of responsible investing. And now a lot of people are using that interchangeably with ESG investing. And that's really the crux of a lot of the confusion about these topics, okay? So that's what we're gonna dive a little bit more into today. So I mentioned the global norms. Slides not changing, there we go. So some of the global norms that have played a role in shaping this dialogue and shaping the priorities of the international financial system are here. And I won't go into each of them in detail, but obviously the UN Paris Agreement of 2015 has had a major impact on how global financial markets are thinking about risk. And I'm going to give you some specific examples of that in this presentation. And so this is probably where I'm going to spend the most time, because it's so important to unpack this piece of it. So I mentioned responsible investing, and a lot of people are using that interchangeably. Can you see my cursor? Jahan, can you see that? Someone let me know if you can see my cursor. Anyhow, I'm pointing at ESG integration. So a lot of folks are mixing ESG integration with responsible investment, but really responsible investment is an entire continuum of approaches to investing. So I'm going to go through each one. Our friend Kevin Pasha at Morgan Stanley likes to call this the shallow end of the pool, where you minimize objectionable impact, in your opinion, down into the deep end of the pool, which is that targeted positive impact. So on the shallow end of the pool, we have restrictive screening, or exclusionary screening, it's also called. That's sort of the classic idea of responsible investing, right? Is that you're avoiding investment in specific companies or industries that you find objectionable. So this has been going on for hundreds of years, right? Not investing in the sin stocks, tobacco, alcohol, etc. And now, you know, some of the more, I guess, trendy ones now are excluding fossil fuels or excluding weapons or those sorts of things. Private prisons is another one. So that's the exclusionary screening. It's just about minimizing objectionable impact. You're not actually looking at what positive impact you want to have, right? So step 2 here into the pool is ESG integration. So when we talk about ESG investing, this is exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about adding E, S, and G criteria as an additional level of risk screening when you're looking at the financial screening of a company as well. So it's the most common approach. It's very popular. It makes perfect sense, right? Why would you want to invest in a company and only look at financial statements? We live in a world where everything is interdependent, and there are a lot of externalities related to environmental impacts, climate change, on the social side related to labor issues, diversity, etc. And then of course on the governance side, which we all, you know, want to protect our investments, right? And like I mentioned, that's been around since the Enron times, and of course the passage of Dodd-Frank and all of the legislation that was meant to basically require more stringent governance disclosures from companies. So the G's been around a little longer, and now we've kind of had this triple coming together of E, S, and G as a way to think about the non-financial criteria when you're looking at a particular investment. So like I said, this is the most common approach, and I'll give you some numbers on that in a minute. A little bit deeper into the pool is what they call thematic exposure or thematic funds. And so those are thinking about a particular theme. Now, they could be impact focused, so gender diversity fund, low carbon energy fund, for example. There are a lot of faith-based funds, and the Roman Catholic Church has, you know, really has popularized this a lot in the 20th century. But there's also just simply geographic themes, like there's MSCI Colombia or MSCI Nigeria. You know, you can look at any sort of theme for a particular fund. And then finally, at the deepest end of the pool, which actually occurs primarily in private markets. So you notice down here, you might see both in public and private markets, these approaches. The true impact investing up until now has really been primarily in private markets. And so impact investing is when an investor is seeking a very specific, measurable E or S, environmental or social return on their investment alongside a financial return. So just one example of a company that's really cool and I heard from earlier this year is called Flairco, and they're an ambulance company in Kenya, right? So they were looking at the UN Sustainable Development Goals as a framework for impact, and it's a widely used to, you know, to think about the impact of companies, both retroactive and proactive. So they were looking at the UN Sustainable Development Goals and saying, hey, you know, there's some opportunities to advance health, public health, and to fill a market need, right? So in Kenya, the ambulance services were a bit fragmented and all over the place, and a lot of people were dying just simply because they could not get emergency care in the right amount of time. And so Flairco has basically sought to create a business that will make a profit and specifically to impact that particular sustainable development goal, and has promised and to track and report on the specific E&S metrics, well, I guess in this case, more social metrics to make sure that they are actually having the desired positive impact, okay? Any questions on that before I move forward? And I actually have to minimize this, I think, so I can see you all. Hey, Jahan, you're going to have to talk. I can't see anyone. If anybody wants to see anything or ask a question right now, just let Jahan know in the chat or speak up, and otherwise I will continue. Okay, great. Okay, so let me just make that big again. I would think I would know how to do this after the pandemic. It's okay. All right. So what's the size of the ESG investing market? As you can see, this has grown exponentially in the past few years. I mean, just absolutely massive growth. Here are some fun numbers for you, but I think the most impactful one, which is not in bold actually, is that currently it's 1 in every $4 under management. That's a lot. You've got these massive growth numbers, 38% from 2016 to 2018. And actually the latest SIF Foundation report just came out this week, so I didn't have time to update the numbers, but I assume that those have gone up as well. And just to parse it out again a little bit, I mentioned here that ESG integration is the most common approach and exclusionary is less common. That's reflected here as well. So just ESG screening is the purple bar chart, and then the exclusionary screening is in blue. Okay, so this is massive, really. And Deloitte put out a study. I think it's in our February newsletter about this projection. So they did a projection if this continues at this rate, that basically you're looking at I believe it's half of all dollars under management in the next 3 to 5 years. Now I'm saying off the top of my head, but you can go look at our newsletter or Google the Deloitte study, but it's basically massive growth. Okay, before I move on to the drivers of why that's the case, just want to talk a little bit again and emphasize how important it is to use the right terminology when we talk about this. We're in Houston, we work a lot with oil and gas companies and in the energy sector. One of the most common things I hear mixed up is ESG being conflated with energy transition and the transition to low carbon economy, and then same thing, ESG being equated to exclusionary screening that wants to kill fossil fuels. So yes, there is some of that, and those are the, you have the exclusionary funds, but that's not actually the majority of the trend. Very, very, very important to distinguish between all of these, because otherwise we're throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? We all want the right risk screening on our investments, on our pensions and our 401ks. That's really what ESG integration is about. So this is actually an excerpt from our Global Affairs Associates responded to a request for comments to the SEC earlier this year that they had put out, and it's very long. If you take a look at it, it's many, many, many pages of questions. And that's an indicator to us that the SEC is also interested in this explosion, wanting to make sure that folks using the terminology are really doing what they claim to be doing. Okay, so this was our recommendations for naming. And I like to show this just to basically give an example, right? So we might say there's a low carbon energy fund. It's a thematic fund, right? Sounds easy enough. We're gonna put a mix of clean energy companies and some low carbon tech, and we're gonna put a solar panel manufacturer in that fund. Well, that certainly fits the theme. However, that is not necessarily an ESG fund. And the reason for that is it might not have any sort of ESG screening criteria on the portfolio companies. Or any, that besides the very basic. So what you might end up with is a solar panel manufacturer that fits into a low carbon fund, but actually has a lot of significant, unmitigated, unmanaged social related risks. And so let me give you an example. Let's say that manufacturer is doing solar panel manufacturing in China, India, and name another place, Thailand. Okay, so they've got all these plants. They have local management. Local regulations around human rights are variable and don't align to international standards depending on which jurisdiction they're in. So what you're actually looking at is an extremely high risk investment where you have all kinds of human rights risk exposure, labor issues exposure, regulatory exposure. You have all of that stuff, but because it's solar panels, it's ended up in this low carbon energy fund. So it's really, really important to think through what we're actually talking about when we talk about an ESG fund or a thematic fund, and making sure, same with an exclusionary fund, you might feel really good that you're in this say alcohol-free, tobacco-free fund, but what are you in, right? Are the companies in actually being screened for basic ESG criteria? Well, you might lose all your money because of poor governance and somebody's scamming, the execs are scamming everyone, but because you felt really good that it was alcohol free. So I don't think I need to go further, but I hope those examples illustrate the point of why it's so important to use the appropriate terminology for the type of investment we're talking about, and that companies also understand that just because they are in the energy industry, in a fossil fuel industry, that they are not necessarily, not ESG friendly. You might have a net zero target and have the most, fabulous environmental conservation program and fit really, really well into an ESG integrated fund. And even, I think what we're going to see down the line is even as part of a clean energy fund. Whereas if, it's not just about excluding, right? And that's not the most prevalent practice. Okay. I have EU taxonomy up here as well. Of course, the EU is much farther ahead in terms of the naming for all of this, but it's tied to the European Green Deal, so there's a lot more specificity. In the US, we're just still trying to get our heads around, I think, how to name and talk about funds appropriately, and then ask funds to actually, and companies to provide the right data so that everybody's kind of on the same playing field with this. Okay, so I'm going to hop over to why. Why is this happening? What's up with the ESG trend? Why does everybody want to know about it? And this is one of my favorite resources, the World Economic Forum, which you're also probably have heard of as the Davos Billionaires Club, but they actually do a lot of really interesting research. This is their Global Risk Report, which they publish every year. And this was the 2021, they come out in January every year. And the most, if you notice at the top, the highest impact, highest likelihood risks that affect, mind you, that affect the global economic and financial systems are all environmentally related. So, and we've seen, of course, we've seen plenty of extreme weather, natural disasters, all of that. Climate action failure, biodiversity loss. These are the biggest risks that the finance folks, they like to say, there was some article calling them the finance gods. The finance gods are concerned about this and how it can impact long-term stability of the financial system. And it's also really interesting to look back on this and see infectious diseases as also quite a high impact, but was considered lower likelihood. Now, more importantly, their most important piece of their report is not just what it looks like with impact and likelihood, but also how they are related, okay? So obviously none of these things happen in a vacuum, and they all are related to other global risks. And so I point out the yellow arrow, infectious diseases, right? So thinking about the pandemic is very much related to human-made environmental disasters, right? The loss of natural disasters, extreme weather, biodiversity loss. Because we have all of that and we're encroaching so much on, on our natural lands, we're getting closer and closer. And I know there's a public health person on the call, very familiar with all of that, how that proximity to wild animals and their loss of habitat and their entrance into more urban areas, how all those things interact to cause higher risk of infectious disease pandemics like the one that we're all living through right now. So finance folks care about this because it's very high impact to financial stability. And I think the pandemic has given us all a taste of what we're talking about when we talk about massive global economic impact related to global risks. This is the perfect example of what that can look and feel like. And of course, none of us like it. Part two of that, so thinking specifically about climate action, the global consensus is that we have to limit GHG emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, by 50% of current levels by 2030 and net zero by 2050. And I think there's a growing recognition, at least the things that I hear and read, that this is not a fossil fuel industry problem. It is an entire world problem. Now, every company, industry, and individual has a role to play. Some have a bigger role than others. But I think the really important thing is that, and what we're seeing across the finance gods communities, the World Economic Forum, Bank of America, the Financial Stability Board, which is made up of the finance ministers of the G20 countries, all of those are very concerned about the impacts of this is not mitigated. And so we all have a part to play in getting on board. But I want to put that into broader context. I think a lot of people, especially our favorite friends, are engineers, and I'm married to one, so I get it, are really love to focus on a technical problem. So they're like carbon, got to reduce our GHGs. But the broader context here is actually thinking about nature conservation, right? So not bulldozing forests and not continuing to bulldoze and pave over the Katy Prairie if you're in the Houston area, which has caused in large part the catastrophic flooding we've experienced here in the past several years in Houston. So basically, keeping that, yes, we have to keep our eye on the GHG issue, but really making sure that we're all understanding that that's in the broader context of nature conservation. Let me just start the time here. Yeah, 5:30. So I want to leave some time for questions. So I'm going to go really quickly through the last few. Another driver of this trend is the millennial generation. The largest wealth transfer in history is now underway, and it's between 24 and $30 trillion over the next decade. And of that demographic, those folks that are inheriting that wealth, is 73% of those surveyed say that they are interested in ESG investments and are actively wanting to invest according to their values. So a lot of the fund managers are really following demand as well. Yeah, so it's not just saving the earth, it's also following the money, okay? And then of course, the potentially high cost of not disclosing ESG data as a company is certainly there in terms of being passed up for additional financing and just wanting to stay in the game, right? And then to give it, just bring it back all the way around. So like, what are we really talking about? And what is the biggest part of the context here? And I think that's really what we're seeing as a recognition that the pure shareholder, pure balance sheet investing has led to a lot of unexpected, unintended externalities, such as inequality, climate change, right, social unrest, all of these things that are actually end up hurting everybody, and like the pandemic, right, because of those externalities. And so I think the bigger context here is in the finance community, this recognition that we have to look at those externalities and take those externalities into account when we do business and in the fundamental conceptualization of what a business is. And so the Business Roundtable, if you're not familiar, is a group of, actually don't many know how many, maybe 100 CEOs, 50 CEOs of American companies and global companies as well. Those include Marathon Oil, BP, Fluor, some of the really big names in energy that have all signed on to this statement saying, hey, it's time for a reset of pure financial, pure shareholder-driven considerations in the boardroom. And the reason for that is, all of these externalities that we're all, experiencing and living through. Part two of that, so that the Business Roundtable, which was sort of the US stamp of approval on stakeholder capitalism, happened last year and in September. And then this one happened in the World Economic Forum's Davos meeting in 2020, basically reiterating that as well. So I think in the broader context, we're seeing this just recognition on the part of the business community and the finance community that we don't all live in vacuums and businesses don't operate in vacuums. And then which is something I think a lot of people have felt and worked hard on for decades now. What we're seeing though is that is starting to basically come into play in financial markets and financial decision making in a way that we've never really seen before on this scale. So that's the ESG investing trend, and I can open for questions now.
Okay, let me start off while everyone's still gathering their questions and their thoughts. Thank you so much, Caitlin. That was a lot that we got to learn from you there. Not towards the investment side. It's kind of generally speaking on, well, in the attitudes of companies going forward. The other day we did have Michael Rubio, the general manager for ESG for Chevron, speaking about the pandemic and how we came back. And okay, not towards investment, but the companies themselves, when it comes to energy, we did see I guess people kind of revert back towards the same fossil fuels and original types of energy, as opposed to moving forward with other types of, more environmentally friendly and more sustainable companies themselves. How long do you think going forward, do you think the trend would kind of, I guess, quote unquote, catch on, or would make that difference? As you say, we are kind of new, at least compared to the EU, and trying to even come up with terminology to set boundaries as well.
Sure. Well, I mean, look, you can look at all of the scenarios. There's, lots of scenarios published out there on what the energy mix looks like in 2050. And honestly, the ones that make the most sense to me are ones, all of them include a role for fossil fuels. We have to remember that oil and natural gas are some of the most efficient fuels that exist, and they make products that haven't been able to be replicated. Now, that said, I think as, the innovation curve, it's going to be a matter of like innovation competing with the status quo, right? Because we're seeing tons of innovation in new plastics, like all of that sort of thing. But I haven't seen enough to see at scale, like that you could replace all the plastics that you use in an emergency room, right? Everybody wants, the right chest tube or whatever. Like it can't be the one that's made of, mushrooms or corn or whatever. If you've seen that Veep episode, no one wants that in their body, right? So we do. I do think that role is there, but what the compromise, so to speak, will be, or how those companies basically help us get to net zero, which many of them are committed to do already, and is to basically decarbonize, right? So there will be fossil fuels in the future. I don't think there's a single scenario that, or let's just say, if you ask the folks that publish scenarios how they get out completely out of fossil fuels, the answer is energy efficiency and demand reduction. So no one is going to get there until we all stop living these extravagant lifestyles that we're so used to, right? So that's why I always say to people, if you like want to get rid of fossil fuels, it's actually really very much a demand question as much as it is, a supply question. That said, I think that the supply is going to decarbonize. And that's what we're seeing. And now whether that ends up being a combination of direct reductions and offsets, that's probably going to be the question. What does that mix look like, rather than absolutely no fossil fuels? Because to be like completely frank, we don't have enough technology to not have petroleum products in our lives. I mean, everything that we own, touch, computers, Teslas, cell phones, everything has petroleum products in it. So until those are able to be replaced at some distant point in the future, and we can use that precious resource for something else, or for reserves for future generations, or whatever that ends up looking like, it's going to be there. So I guess that's what I would say. Part two of that is, a lot of people are hesitant about carbon offsets, and it's just a pass to pollute and all of that. And what's happening on that side of things is really exciting too, because that's actually a new market that's going to be, that's in development. And there's actually a task force on, what's it called? Task force on viable carbon markets or something like that. I can look it up and add it to the chat. But there are people actively working on this. This was one of the major topics for the Conference of the Parties for the Paris Agreement last December. They weren't able to reach an agreement on how to scale voluntary carbon markets. That's what it is. Task Force on Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets. But, they weren't able to get there. But what I heard was there is sorry, I just saw Bob's question, so I was kind of processing that. I'll get to that in a second, Bob. Thank you. Anyhow, let me just pause there because I lost my train of thought.
Thank you. Yeah, no, thank you for telling us the truth and what's going to happen, and what needs to be done. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Looks like we have a question from Bob. Let's see. Do you want to read that, if you can see it right there?
Yeah, he says, I fully agree with your realistic view of oil and gas and their products. Please explain the difference between tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. Bob, are you referring to scope 1? Just to clarify, I'm not sure what you mean by tier 1, 2, and 3. But I'm guessing he means scope 1, 2, and 3 from the GHG protocol. I will go ahead and explain that, and unless Bob disagrees with me there in the chat. There is the global standard for measuring, discussing, etc. greenhouse gas emissions is called the GHG protocol. You can go ghgprotocol.org. You can see all the standards. You can download all of the Excel spreadsheets to do your own calculations. It's all there at GHG protocol. And the way that they talk about how to conceptualize greenhouse gas emissions of a company, really of anybody, are 3 scopes. So scope 1 is direct combustion. So you are personally burning the fuel. So when I put gasoline in my vehicle and I turn on the vehicle, those are my scope 1 emissions. Same if you're an industrial manufacturer and you're burning natural gas generator or something on site, those are scope 1 emissions. Scope 2 is indirect or purchased electricity, right? So it's relatively simple. You look at your electricity bill, and there are, again, in GHG protocol, you can figure out how much carbon equivalent that is in terms of emissions. And then scope 3 is where it gets a little bit confusing and a little bit challenging, and that's the whole value chain of your company. Okay, so the very common example that you hear a lot about is employee travel. So commuting and travel, right? So the airplanes, the vehicles, et cetera, in the value chain. And then more importantly, in the context of the energy industry and the oil and gas industry, is the embedded emissions of the product. So that's been a major focus for a lot of these initiatives, is saying it's awesome that you want to reduce scope 1 and 2, but your product itself is like really concentrated harm and pollution, right, to the environment. Now, obviously, you know, it gives us the lifestyle that we all enjoy, right, which I mentioned before. No one is innocent in this. But that's what Scope 3 is, or the big conversation around Scope 3 in oil and natural gas companies is how about the emissions of the products, right, themselves. So when we talk about a net zero target, you have to set a boundary, right? It can't be literally every emission, or you'd end up being interdependent with the entire world, right? So it's usually focused initially on scopes 1 and 2, which are within the control of a company. Value chain is where it gets a little bit more fuzzy and requires a little bit more work. And the scope 3 guidance for oil and gas for a science-based target, for how to set a reduction target or a net zero target, is actually not even published yet, okay? You can go to Science-Based Targets. They had a request for comments. They were out for comments. I don't believe they've even been published yet. That comment round just ended like a month and a half ago. So that's just another way of showing too that this is all being developed live. Like, we're all participating as you know, our way forward collectively is developed around this. I hope that answered your question, Bob. Let's see.
We have time for a couple quick questions before we hand out. Looks like we have one from Mariana. Mariana, we do see your video on. If you'd like to present that question yourself, you're more than welcome to.
Thank you. Hi, Caitlin.
Hi.
Anyways, great presentation as always. Thank you very much. I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about the difference that usually exists between the European way, that it's more policy and regulation based, versus the American that's more market based. And within that, what do you see that will become the real drivers, besides the one that you mentioned, millennials and all that, towards really becoming an impulse for ESG?
Yes, I am putting a couple of things in the chat right now. So absolutely, you're totally agree. That's definitely the approach. But I think that's the exciting thing about what we can create here in the US, that's also, of course, directly linked to what's happening around the world. And a lot of places are ahead of us on this, right? But the cool thing is that we are in the midst of creating a new market. Well, let's just say a new market. And Marianne, you have direct experience on this. The first time that this was tried after Kyoto, right? And a lot of the kinks from the carbon markets after Kyoto have now been, you know, addressed and are starting to be worked out so that we can get a market that really, really does function. The other cool thing is it's 2020, right? There are ways to do verification much, much better than there was, you know, 20 years ago. You have blockchain, you have all kinds of new tools to basically enable a market and basically an entirely new asset class of carbon. And that's the exciting piece of this, is that, you know, and you hear it a lot in the Houston scene when you're talking to carbon capture, use and storage companies. You know, there's a lot going on with like biomimicry. There's a great company called Cemvita Factory that's actually using microbes to eat carbon and produce something else. So actually just basically thinking about this liability, it's a global liability, but thinking of it as a resource and as an opportunity, right? How do we take that and turn it into an economic opportunity? And the big, so I put in the chat, Task Force on Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets. And then there's also some really great publications out of Goldman Sachs. If you look at Carbonomics, they're doing a lot of work on this as well. So I do think that we're going to see a more market-driven approach. And this actually dovetails with Amanda's question. The next question there, which is, Caitlin, what potential policies have you seen that people can look into and encourage our representatives to support? And I'll put this in the chat too. Climate Leadership Council is you know, probably the most realistic and effective carbon legislation that there is, and has members from the oil and gas industry, from progressive groups. Like, you really got the whole gamut of people, you know, really standing up and saying, this is the market-based solution that we want in the United States. Companies are on the Hill supporting this. Companies like BP, they're on the Hill supporting this because they want certainty too. It's not fun if you're a company that has to deal with different regulations from California to New Mexico to Texas to Calgary, wherever you're operating. It's actually a huge regulatory burden to make sure that you're meeting all of the different requirements. So from a business perspective, it makes a lot of sense to be on the Hill advocating for a carbon tax, because it basically gives everybody certainty and kind of levels the playing field, right? And then part two of that is that, of course, if you're familiar with any of the economics work on this, that's considered to be the best and most fast approach to actually achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement is through market-based solutions, like a carbon tax. And there's some conservative groups that back it as well. Americans for Carbon Dividends, I think, because the whole crux of the plan is that the dividend from the carbon tax actually goes into the pockets of everyday Americans, so ends up in our bank account. So it's a really exciting kind of quadruple win. So that's where I would encourage you to take a look at. And there've been different proposals in Congress. Someone else on my team knows the details of that better, but that's where I would take a look in terms of thinking about what kind of legislation to support. Paul.
Yeah, lastly, if you can, we have a couple minutes, if you could comment on Paul's comment, and that might be the last one we have for the day.
Okay, great question. I'm sorry, I guess I should read it. Paul's wondering, he says, I'm a chemical engineer, and one of the comments I've heard is that we should save petrochemicals for synthesis, e.g. making plastics. Yes, absolutely. If we want all of our future generations to be able to use plastics, we can't use it all ourselves. Using, which is a gross oversimplification, I understand for all the petrochemical people, but I mean, philosophically, that's an important thing to think about. Using petrochemical in general leads to carbon pollution, but if the carbon is bound in products, then it might not affect the environment so much. There's talk, for example, of using carb and carbon dioxide, I think that carb and carbon dioxide in the production of cement and binding it. Absolutely, that's a real product. You can go buy that today and pave your driveway with it, I think. Hawaii is one of the states that I know has already been doing this, so laying new roads using the cement products that trap this. There's another company I recently connected with, forgetting, I think it's called Aureus Earth, and they're talking about that for the use of all new construction. So imagine if every new building we constructed was using this technology. Oh, thanks. Okay, I thought it was carbon. Thanks for that, Paul. Yeah, it's out there, and I think that's the promise of a lot of these products. I think though, if we go back to the bigger context, like is mentioned, of just generally lower consumption by everyone, and the context of nature itself, so not overconsumption. Like, I don't think the hesitation there is we don't want to get into a cycle where we're just making new products for the sake of it, right? And more stuff that's going to end up in a landfill. I mean, if you put it in the bigger context of we're trying to, a lot of us, and I think everybody who I talk to, no matter where they fall on any political spectrum, want a world where we can go fishing and eat the fish that we catch, right? Or whatever it is, go hiking. Like, we all want to live in that world. And so I think that's that broader context is, yes, absolutely. Can we draw down carbon in the creation of new products and new roads? That's awesome. And let's think about also not continuing to encroach too far on the natural habitats of wild animals and the things that cause pandemics, right? So it's just that balance. But I do believe in an all above approach to the solution. You can't exclude any one you know, one particular solution or industry, but I think thinking about those nature-based solutions as well are also really, really important. So soil carbon storage, you know, huge potential. There's a group in Houston called Soil Value Exchange that's working on that. They're amazing, check them out. And just kind of taking an all of the above approach, because we will need everybody on board. And that includes the oil and gas industry, who, by the way, have, you know, if you look at climate risk reporting numbers, the vast majority of climate risk reports being published are being done by oil and gas companies. So, and like I said, they're on the Hill advocating for a carbon tax with the Climate Leadership Council. We can't get there unless we have everybody. So we have to stop talking about excluding this group or that group or so-and-so. Like, we really need everybody on board. And that's, I guess that's what I would say about that. There was a great NOVA program on carbon balance in the world that I would recommend. Thank you, Paul. We will check that out.
Well, thank you so much, Caitlin. Once again, thank you for bringing us, letting us know about that issue and breaking it down for us, for the lay people, for someone who, like myself, who doesn't know too much about that. I appreciate that you making it nice and clear and concise for all of us here. And lastly, if you could just let people know how to reach you and to reach you at Global Affairs Associates, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So our website is globalaffairs.associates.com. I will put my email in the chat. And our number is on there. You can schedule a meeting with me on there if your company or fund is trying to think about how to incorporate this stuff. And feel free to get in touch.
Well, thank you once again for an excellent presentation.
Sorry, thank you, Jahan. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just saying I forgot that there's LinkedIn also. You can find me on LinkedIn.
Definitely, will do. Well, thank you again, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us today. It's been a great program. I look forward to seeing you all in the future. You all have a wonderful Thanksgiving break, and we look forward to seeing you at our next program. Thank you, Caitlin, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, John. Thanks, everyone.